Welcome to On the Money Line, a podcast by MMA Play 365. I'm Newsom, and I'm here to break down UFC London, which goes down this weekend in the UK, in England, in my home country. Excited for the fights, also excited for the afternoon start of the fights as well. But yeah, look, this isn't the blockbuster pay-per-view type of card that the UFC brought last time they came to the UK, but for a fight night, man, this card's stacked. It's got some really good fights. And look, for a fight night, I don't actually think it's a million miles away from where a UK pay-per-view would be. Like I say, there's some really good fights top to bottom. And there's 2, 3, maybe 4 fights which I think are just going to be absolutely electric, that are going to be the fights that people are talking about as well. So overall, I'm not just saying it because the UFC's in London, but man, I do think this is going to be a really stacked fight night with some amazing fights, and I'm really looking forward to it. But just before we get into the breakdowns, as always, if you want to jump into the action this weekend from a betting perspective, then make sure you do so at MMA Play 365. We've got something for every type of gambler, whether you're a fun gambler, whether you're a long-term gambler, whether you're somebody that just wants to follow and tail exactly what the professional handicapper is betting on. We've got all those 3 sections for you in one subscription, and also included in every betting subscription as well is our AI software, Base AI, which gives you a percentage prediction for every possible outcome of every fight on every UFC event. And like I say, we don't split those subscriptions up. Everything's all included, and all the betting subscriptions are super affordable as well. $5 for one event, $10 per month, or if you want the 12 months annual subscription, it's just $99 for that. So that's everything all in one subscription, super affordable. Head over to MMAplay365.com. And with the introduction out the way, with the promo out the way, let's get breaking down some fights. And we start, as we always do, in the main event, 5 rounds. We've got Leon Edwards versus Sean Brady. Now, this is the first fight for Leon Edwards since he lost his belt. So, you know, from where I'm looking at this fight, obviously the stylistic edges that we need to talk about, that I'll discuss. But I also think there's other elements between both fighters in this fight that play a prominent role into where I'm sort of positioning my analysis and overall where my prediction and my pick is going to be at. And that's elements other than style versus style and skill set versus skill set. And I suppose I'm going to start straight away with this. And I just feel that I talk quite a lot sometimes about not only fighter trajectory, but also fighters catching opponents at just the right time. And I feel that we've got a big element of this, and I'll get into that in just a little bit. But in regards to one of the elements outside of the stylistic matchup, I just want to focus on Leon Edwards, because from a mentality perspective, it's going to be really interesting to see where he is actually at from a mentality perspective, because you've got a fighter here who not only has just lost his belt, and that's always one element to talk about, you know, for any champion that loses the belt, that first fight back. Where are they at? They've got to rebuild. You know, are they going to rebuild quickly? Are they going to be straight away in for another title shot? And different champions or fighters that have just lost the belt can sometimes be in a different position. So, for example, with Alex Pereira, that lost a couple of weeks ago against Ankalaev, it's very likely that Pereira gets a rematch. And if he doesn't get a rematch, it's probably one more win for him, and then he gets another title fight. But with Leon Edwards, I just don't think that's going to be the case. The division's moving really fast as it is, but not only that, Leon Edwards, to actually get his title fight, needed to go on a 9-fight win streak over 5 years, and that would have been 10 fights within that win streak as well if it wasn't for that no contest with Belal Muhammad, because at that point, Leon Edwards was absolutely styling on Belal Muhammad, and, you know, that would have ended up being a 10-fight win streak over 5 years to get that title shot, which not many fighters have to go through that longevity of just winning fight after fight after fight and over so long as well. But Leon Edwards had to do that. So he got his title fight. He defended it 3 times. Well, he defended it twice, sorry. So he beat Kamaru Usman for the title, defended it against Usman in a rematch, then he defended his title against Colby Covington, and then of course he lost it last time out in the rematch against Belal Muhammad, where Belal looked absolutely phenomenal. Now, the fact that Leon Edwards, like I say, is coming off that title loss in his head, he must be very aware that it's very unlikely that he's going to get another title fight in the UFC, because it took him that long to build himself up to a title fight. For the UFC to give him that shot, it's very unlikely that he's going to get it again. And like, you know, he's not going to go on another, 5-year unbeaten streak, racking up 9 and 10 wins at the top of the division. So where Leon Edwards must be at from a mentality perspective, it's really intriguing. And, I'm not saying he's going to be this or he's going to be that. I'm just saying I don't know. Like, we'll find out, because I'm pretty sure when a fighter is sort of down on themselves or down and out from a mentality perspective, we see that at this level in the UFC, especially when you're fighting, at the upper end of the division, which this fight for Leon Edwards is at. So that's one element of this. Now, I briefly touched upon fighters catching fighters at just the right time, and I kind of feel that that's what we've got here. I think Sean Brady is catching Leon Edwards at just the right time. Edwards is off his win streak. He's off a championship title loss. So just from that alone, and bear in mind, Brady's on, a win streak now himself, coming off a phenomenal main event 5-round fight against Gilbert Burns, where, like I say, he absolutely dominated Gilbert Burns, landed over 100 plus significant strikes for a fighter that's not predominantly a striker, scored, I think it was 7 takedowns against Gilbert Burns. So he proved that he had absolutely no fear of going to the mat with, a lethal BJJ black belt, a legitimate lethal BJJ black belt in Gilbert Burns. So I think Brady's on a massive high at the minute, and it's completely the opposite for Leon Edwards. And then when you look at sort of, I'm not saying Leon Edwards is on a decline, but one thing I specifically noticed is, look, Leon Edwards has always been very underrated, in my opinion, in regards to defensive wrestling and defensive grappling, and even offensively in both wrestling and grappling. I just feel that those have always been a really underrated, skill set of Leon Edwards, and he's always been able to lean on that in fights where some people think that he doesn't have a wrestling or grappling advantage, or he's going to get rolled over from his opponent's wrestling and grappling. So I've always thought that about Leon, that they've been underrated qualities. Now, when you look at his last 3 fights or 4 fights, like, Leon Edwards is actually being taken down now quite a lot of times. He's given up 20 takedowns. Again, across the 2 Kamaru Usman fights, Colby Covington and Belal Muhammad, he's given up 20 takedowns, which is very unlike Leon Edwards of old. So now I'm thinking, well, is other fighters' skill sets just starting to catch up now? Is Leon Edwards, showing some holes that he's never shown before within his defensive wrestling and grappling? And then when you look at Sean Brady over his last 4 fights, he's secured 17 takedowns. Brady's wrestling and grappling is where he's predominantly best, and I kind of think that's where he's going to get at Leon here. But on the flip side to that, again, we're coming off Sean Brady that's just landed 130 strikes over 5 rounds, which Leon Edwards, he has landed 100 plus strikes in other fights, but typically speaking, he's quite low volume. He's also had 5-round fights where he's landed over 50, 60 strikes, which, again, like I say, I just don't think Edwards is, from a striking perspective, is too active. But if we've got a Sean Brady that's now landing 130 strikes over 5 rounds, and that's not his predominant style and skill set within his game, he's going to be leveling up massively. And like I say, from a wrestling and grappling perspective, we've got a fighter here that's completed 17 takedowns across his last 4 fights against the Leon Edwards that's given up 20 takedowns in his last 4 fights. And to be honest with you, I don't think, especially in the second Kamaru Usman fight, he was facing the best version of Usman. Definitely not the best version of Colby Covington. I do think, to his credit, he was facing the best version of Belal Muhammad, but still, he's facing the best version of Sean Brady here. I just feel that from a striking perspective, Leon Edwards is going to be the better technical striker here. But judges don't score technique, they score efficiency, they score volume, and I just feel that Brady's going to land more volume from a striking perspective. But then when it comes to the wrestling and grappling, I just think Brady's way ahead of Leon Edwards. Like, I love these guys from Renzo Gracie and Philly under, coach Daniel Gracie, who's got some legitimate BJJ black belts Daniel Gracie has underneath him, like the likes of Sean Brady, the likes of Pat Sabatini, the likes of Andrey Petrosky, there's more as well, but I just feel that this is the right time for Brady. I think he's well coached, well trained. That's the other thing as well. The gym in the UK that Leon Edwards was training at, Team Renegade, that's had a split over the last sort of like 6 months, and some fighters have gone one way, some fighters have gone the other, some fighters are now doing their own thing. I don't actually know specifically what Leon Edwards is doing, but I just, like I say, when you're looking at this fight as a whole, I just think there's so much upside on Sean Brady. I think he's going to have stylistic advantages here. I think he's catching Leon Edwards at the right time, and like I say, I think everything else, sort of surrounding the fight, the training, the coaching, it's hard to look past Brady here. So for those reasons, I'm picking Sean Brady to win this fight. And in the next fight, in the co-main event, we've got Jan Blachowicz versus Carlos Ulberg. And this is a really interesting fight at light heavyweight. It's a fight where, look, for I love Carlos Ulberg. Like, I've bet on him a couple of times now. I feel that, he needed to get over his initial sort of greenness, if you like, initial hurdles when he first came into the UFC. But I just think he's grown from strength to strength in the UFC. And now he's a fighter that I think could legitimately be heading towards a potential title fight. Now, there are going to be a couple of fighters in the way there that, they're going to be, or at least from Ulberg's perspective, he's going to be an underdog against a couple of fighters. Like if he fought Alex Pereira, for example, kickboxer versus kickboxer, it's going to be interesting. I think Pereira would probably beat Carlos Ulberg, or at least you would think so anyway. But like, Ulberg's got the ability, though, to be competitive with the best of the best in regards to striking. He is a very good striker. Now, the thing is, for Ulberg, he's like 34, 35 now, which is probably prime for a light heavyweight. But I kind of think it is now or never for Ulberg. Like, if he goes on a couple of fights, if he loses this fight against Jan Blachowicz, I don't think it's completely over for him. I think he can rebuild. He's probably got one more rebuild, though, if he's wanting a potential title fight. If he's just wanting, to be a solidified UFC fighter, he's probably got the rest of his career. But if he went on a 2-fight losing streak, then I think it's done. But the point that I'm trying to make here for Carlos Ulberg is, like, it's now or never for Ulberg. But the good news for him is he's very much in his prime. He's very much looking sharp. He's looking good. He's looking solid. Now, what Jan Blachowicz is going to bring to the table here is, the veteran qualities. He's a former champion. He's one of these fighters that, if you're not ready for the top of the division, he's absolutely going to expose you and show that. He's, I wouldn't say he's prolific in any one specific area, but he's very good everywhere. And especially against somebody like Carlos Ulberg, like if Jan Blachowicz goes strike for strike with Ulberg, I think he's getting knocked out, or, at minimum, I think he's getting pieced up. But what Jan Blachowicz will do, in my opinion, is not just go strike for strike. I think he'll make this a true mixed martial arts fight. He'll, look to get a hold of Carlos Ulberg. He'll look to try and drag Carlos Ulberg down to the mat. He'll look to try and grapple him to break the rhythm and the flow up that Ulberg will be trying to, build momentum on the feet strike. And this is what Blachowicz is going to do. Now, from a betting perspective, you're looking at some bookies now that have got Carlos Ulberg at like minus 260, and I just think it's too much. I think, anything around minus 200, probably, minus 180, minus 190. I think those are the lines that, given the momentum and, again, the trajectory that Carlos Ulberg is on, I think those are the lines that make more sense. But at minus 260, it's almost like Carlos Ulberg's a near lock against Blachowicz, and I don't think that's going to be the case. Like, Blachowicz is one of these tricky veterans that just won't let you get away with anything. He's seen everything as well. Like, he's been around long enough. Carlos Ulberg isn't going to deliver anything that Blachowicz hasn't seen before, and I do think there's going to be moments where Blachowicz does get a hold of Carlos Ulberg. He does push him back to the. He does push his back to the cage. Blachowicz. I'm not sure who's going to have the strength advantage here, but Blachowicz is definitely going to be in and around it. I don't think he's going to get blown away by Ulberg's physicality. I think Blachowicz will hold his own. The old man strength, as they say. So I think there's going to be moments in this fight where Blachowicz is holding, is pushing Ulberg's back to the mat. He might score a takedown or two, make Ulberg work back up to his feet. Does that start tiring Ulberg out? Potentially. And if Ulberg does start tiring out, then Blachowicz will take over from a striking perspective as well. It's just, when I'm looking at this fight as a whole, although I do think that Blachowicz is going to have these moments where he's stalling and again breaking that flow and rhythm of Ulberg striking, I just think the better quality, the better body of work in this fight is going to be Ulberg within the striking. So in between Blachowicz potentially clinching him and getting a hold of him, I think Ulberg's going to be landing some really solid strikes. He's going to be looking like he's, again, like I said, just flowing inside the cage, being active, landing volume, and again, just looking efficient and just landing on Blachowicz. Hard strikes as well. Maybe he starts busting Blachowicz up. Maybe he starts rocking him. And look, if that's the case, the longer this fight goes on, the less likely it is that Blachowicz is going to try tying up with him and clinching him, because when he does, he's going to have to get through the striking fire of Ulberg. And even at short range, Ulberg's got that kickboxing background. He's got the elbows, he's got the knees. So Blachowicz is going to have to go through a little bit of fire here to be able to get a hold of Ulberg. And again, he's got years and years of experience at the highest level in the UFC. So I'd imagine he'll have some success, but is it going to be enough success for him to win the fight that way? I just don't think it is. I think the better quality of work is from an effective striking perspective is going to come from Ulberg, and that's going to be enough to get him over the line, whether he finishes Blachowicz, knocks him out, or if it goes to a decision and the judges are looking, they're probably going to be looking at Blachowicz that has, stalled a little bit, broken the flow, had a lot of time in the clinch and trying to get takedowns, versus Ulberg that's doing actual damage. And I think that's the way I'm leaning as well. So for those reasons, I'm picking Carlos Ulberg to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Kevin Holland. That's right, Kevin Holland, he seems to be on every other card at this point, versus Gunnar Nelson. Now, this is a really interesting fight because I kind of feel it's one of these head-heart situations, which you should always go with your head over your heart, but I've just got a gut feeling it's going to be it's going to be a bit of a trap bet, this, if you're on the side of Gunnar Nelson. And I'm going to explain all this. So look, with Kevin Holland seems to have the majority of issues, or his bigger issues he seems to have when he's fighting opponents that look to get him down to the mat. Now, I did bet against Kevin Holland in his last 3 losses, or the Rainier Derrida one, actually. I think it was a recommended bet on the MMA Play 365 website, but I lost the plus money and kind of didn't want to go into the pick'em or the slight favourite as where Rainier Derrida's line went. But I definitely bet him as an underdog. I definitely bet against him, when Dolidze was an underdog. I bet against him when MVP was an underdog as well. Now, although MVP was a different fight because that was a striking fight, look, Dolidze beat him on the ground. Rainier Derrida beat him on the ground. There's been so many examples of where Kevin Holland struggled the most is when opponents are better wrestling and grappling, and he just doesn't seem to have too much of an answer, even though he's a good grappler himself. So now the UFC have matched him up against Gunnar Nelson, and it's kind of, along with, when it comes down to the hardcore MMA fan base, it's kind of a known thing now when Kevin Holland fights a grappler that Kevin Holland's going to be in trouble. And I do think, look, if Gunnar Nelson gets Kevin Holland down to the mat, then Gunnar Nelson is absolutely going to be the better grappler in this fight. And look, from a pure grappling perspective, some might argue from a straight technical skill set that Gunnar Nelson's the better grappler than Roman Dolidze, and a better grappler than Rainier Derrida as well, because I think people genuinely forget how good Gunnar Nelson is on the mat. It's just, now when you're looking at the betting markets, you're not getting Kevin Holland as the favourite against these grapplers where you can trust that at least you're making a good bet. Win or lose, you've got that plus money against Kevin Holland against a grappler, because now Gunnar Nelson is sort of like, depending on where you look, minus 135, minus 140, minus 150, and that, from a head perspective, is what absolutely makes sense, because, again, at the risk of repeating myself for like a 4th time, Kevin Holland has issues against grapplers, and Gunnar Nelson is a predominant grappler and a very good grappler as well. So now the odds make sense. But what's different here, what's different to Gunnar Nelson right now than Rainier Derrida, than Roman Dolidze, for example, is I don't think Gunnar Nelson's in his prime. Gunnar Nelson also hasn't fought for 2 years. His last 3 wins in the UFC, in fact, we'll go even further. Let's look at his last 4 wins in the UFC dating back to 2017, is Brian Barberena, who's retired, Takashi Sato, no longer with the UFC, Cowboy Oliveira, I think he's getting knocked out by guys on his regional scene now. Alan Jouban is now working the desk at the UFC, so retired. And that's his last 4 wins in the UFC. And Kevin Holland is just levels above, those fighters of where they're at now. So then you add in the 2-year layoff for Gunnar Nelson. And now I'm thinking, well, is this a trap bet? Because naturally you'd think, okay, well, we're not getting minus 200 or minus 250 on the grappler. Maybe minus 130 looks good. But what Kevin Holland's going to have here is activity on his side. There's going to be no ring rust, cage rust, whatever you want to call it. I think he's going to be faster. I think he's going to be more athletic. From a striking perspective, I think he's definitely going to be the better striker who hits harder as well. It's just like I say, the issue is if he gets taken down and Gunnar Nelson takes his back, he's either going to finish him or it's going to be a long night. And it's a super, super tough one because of the odds. Like, I just wish Gunnar Nelson was the underdog because it'd just make everything so simple. You'd be able to take the chance on the older guy that's not been in there in 2 years and hasn't fought, hasn't beaten a top level UFC fighter for a number of years, but he's got the skill set. And like I say, you can negate the inactivity and the recent form because of the plus money, but you can't negate that when he's the favourite. So it is very much head and heart, but I've got a gut feeling this is going to be a trap bet. So what I'm going to do is, as I preach, I'm going to go with my head, with my analysis, because again, the bottom line is Kevin Holland has trouble against guys that are super good grapplers, and Gunnar Nelson's a super good grappler. So historically speaking, this is going to be a fight that's going to be difficult for Kevin Holland. So that's where my head's at from the analysis, and I'm going to pick Nelson to win the fight because of that. However, it's a betting podcast. If you're looking to bet this fight, I just think it is got to be dog or pass, because there's other elements of this fight other than, well, Kevin Holland struggles against grapplers. Like I say, he's going to be, he's more active, younger, faster, quicker, more athletic, power on the feet against the inactivity of Gunnar Nelson. Why has he been inactive? Was it injuries? Did he take some time off? So I think there's definite risk if you're playing Gunnar Nelson a favourite here. Like I say, I just wish he was the underdog because it'd make things so much simpler. But look, from a straight pick and prediction perspective, I'm going to go with my head and my analysis, and I'm picking Gunnar Nelson to win this fight. And in the next fight, we're going to have fan favourite Molly Meatball McCann versus Alexia Thainara. The crowd are going to go insane for Molly McCann. She loves the crowd love her. And, she is exciting. She's got charisma. She's got the aura about her inside the cage. I like Molly McCann. I think she's a fighter that, wears her heart on her sleeve and will bite down on the mouthpiece, bang, scrap, do whatever she can to make the fight interesting and to make the crowd go wild. So yeah, look, from a fighter perspective, I do really like her. Now, Alexia Thainara making a UFC debut, she's actually taken this fight on short notice. Molly McCann should have been fighting Estela Nunes. Estela Nunes, I believe it was maybe visa issues, and then Alexia Thainara stepped in. Now, what I found really interesting is when the betting lines were released for this fight with Thainara, like I say, it was a short notice fight, so they were released later than, of course, the other fights on the card. I was very surprised to see that Thainara was the favourite, and she's actually like a slight to moderate favourite as well. And I'd not looked into the fight, so I was only surprised because Molly McCann's the hometown girl and, tends to do well against, the lower level of the division, if that makes sense. So I was very surprised to see Thainara as the favourite. So when I looked into the fight, after looking at Thainara, I do kind of understand the line, and also I think that Molly McCann's now got a harder opponent. Now, what makes things potentially a little bit easier for McCann is that she's now got an opponent on short notice rather than an opponent that's had a full fight camp, and you do have to take that into consideration. But where Molly McCann really thrives in the UFC is against fighters that have got a specific hole. So if a fighter's got a hole in the wrestling and grappling, well, look, Molly McCann's good everywhere, so she'll expose that wrestling and grappling. She'll shoot takedowns, she'll get on top. She's shown that she can be very good there. If an opponent has got issues in regards and holes in regards to the striking, then man, Molly McCann's going to expose that, because she's aggressive, she comes forward, she wings bombs. She's actually got super good cardio as well for somebody that will land a ton of volume and hard volume as well, so putting power behind a lot of the strikes. But that's where McCann thrives. She thrives on finding the holes of her opponents, but more importantly, by being the aggressor, being the fighter moving forward, being the one that's pushing the action. And when fighters or when opponents push back on that and think, well, if you're going to push on me, I'm going to stand my ground, dig my heels in, and I'm going to, we're going to crash in the middle if that's what you want to do. That's when McCann can get got at herself, if that makes sense. And I think that this is what's going to happen in this fight with Thainara. Thainara is aggressive herself. She's super powerful. She's imposing in the cage. And I don't think that she's going to back down from McCann. I don't think she's going to be on the back foot a lot or allow McCann to push her on the back foot. And therefore, we're going to see a crash of the pocket. Now, when they crash in the pocket, both women here are going to be absolutely game. I actually think this is going to be a sick fight, by the way. Like, I think it's going to be super entertaining. I think both women are going to bite down. But where in these types of fights where they're biting down and they're exchanging, somebody's going to be getting the better of the exchanges. And I just feel that is going to be Thainara. I think there's from a technical striking perspective, I think she's got the slight edge. From a power perspective, potentially the slight edge. From a striking variety perspective, mixing in low kicks and going to the body, potentially some tinies and things like that. I just think that, again, the slight edges are with Thainara there, and this is what's going to make it a tough fight for McCann. Now, the one thing we do need to watch out for here is Thainara does come forward, she does hit hard, she does like to land volume. What type of short notice is this for her? Was she fight ready? Was she already in camp waiting for a call up somewhere? Or has she come off the couch? Because if she's come off the couch, and again, that's just, a tongue-in-cheek phrase. All fighters at this level are training every day. It's the job, or at least you would hope they are. So, if Thainara is coming in off the couch here, and she has a great first round, does she start slowing down? Does she start whiffing and gassing a little bit? And if she does, then I think Molly McCann's going to absolutely make her pay for that. Come on late and beat her. But we don't know that yet. We don't know that that's going to happen. All you can go on is from what you've seen on previous fight footage, on tape. And I just think Thainara's got the skill set, the power, the aggression to really prevent Molly McCann from thriving in this fight, specifically from thriving in this fight. And that way, because of that, it should allow Thainara to have a lot of success. So for those reasons, I'm picking Alexia Thainara to win this fight. And in the next fight, this is going to be a good fight. We've got Jordan Vucenic versus Chris Duncan. Now, Vucenic made his UFC debut against Guram Kutateladze. I believe that was short notice as well. We'll talk about Kutateladze a little bit later on because he's on this card as well. I bet Vucenic, I think at like plus 225, plus 230, something like that. And look, man, he had a good first round, but then it just all kind of slowed down for him after that first round, and it just fell apart a little bit to the point where Kutateladze took over enough to beat him. But Vucenic definitely, look, UFC debut on short notice against Guram Kutateladze is just not an easy task for any fighter, so it's not anything you can hold against Vucenic, who, when I broke that fight down, I preached Jordan Vucenic. Jordan Vucenic's a fighter that I've watched throughout Cage Warriors, his rise throughout Cage Warriors into the UFC, and he's been UFC ready now for like at least 2 years. I don't know what took so long, but Vucenic is someone I've been preaching for a while. He's so good everywhere. He's a calm striker, but he's also, he can be quite a nasty striker at times, although he doesn't have that typical one-punch KO. He can butcher away at you with the elbows, the knees, with the Thai style that he's got. But then he also wrestles and grapples quite well. Now, what I said about Leon Edwards right at the top of this podcast is, he was a fighter in this country that is always been underrated, and people and MMA fans think that some fighters from the UK can't be good wrestlers and grapplers when we've got some really good wrestlers and grapplers. Just because they don't have the the NCAA collegiate wrestling, high school, university backgrounds that these guys have got doesn't mean that in MMA they can't be good wrestlers and grapplers, and Vucenic is definitely an example of that because he is a good wrestler and grappler. Now on the flip side, you've got Chris Duncan, who is exactly the same. From Scotland, he's also a good wrestler and a good grappler. Again, at a certain level, look, there's always going to be levels in this sport, and that will come with an overall MMA perspective. It will come from levels in strike and levels in wrestling and grappling. But at this level in the UFC, these guys are good wrestlers, good grapplers, and they're good strikers as well. And I think it's a really good fight, and I definitely think it's way closer than the betting line suggests. I'm sure Vucenic's up at like -350, -360 at some books, which I think is unbelievably disrespectful to Chris Duncan, because Duncan, again, training at American Top Team as well. He's a fighter that's been getting better now for a couple of years. He came into the UFC a little bit reckless, a little bit rough around the edges, if you like, but at American Top Team, he's tidied his game up. He's looking like he's fixing, patching holes and looking like he's developing a certain style and skill set that's going to drive him through a lot of these fights. And I'm telling you now, Duncan's going to be well trained and well prepared here. Now, the one area that I still worry for Chris Duncan a little bit in some of these fights is the fact that, he can get super aggressive sometimes still. That is his style, it's his nature, that's fine, and it's what makes him an exciting fighter. But he can also be got at because of that, finding holes in from a defensive perspective when he's overexerting himself and looking for power. But the thing is, like I said with Vucenic, he's not known for this one-punch knockout power. So although I'm not saying he can't knock Chris Duncan out, because he absolutely could, what I'm saying is I just don't think it's like a massively high percentage outcome where I'm sitting here thinking, well, Chris Duncan's facing a big power puncher and he might get knocked out. I don't think that's the case here. I actually think we're going to see a lot of wrestling and grappling in this fight, and maybe not just takedown after takedown, but clinch work, looking for the underhooks, takedowns against the cage, standing back up. And I think, look, the fight and the way I'm seeing this with both fighters is I just think it's super close. From a striking perspective, I think Chris Duncan's got the power advantage. Vucenic might have the technical striking advantage, but it's not as if Duncan can't strike. Duncan's a good striker himself, but I think Vucenic has got the technical striking advantage, the slight technical striking advantage. I think Chris Duncan's absolutely got the power advantage. Then when it comes to the wrestling, I think they're both very good offensively. I think they're both very good defensively. Grappling wise, I think Vucenic might be the slightly better fighter. If you're looking at, who does the better work on top of their opponent here, I think Vucenic does a better job on top of Duncan than Duncan does on Vucenic. But I just don't know if it's going to be enough for Vucenic, if he gets Duncan down and gets on top of him, to sit on top of him for like 2 or 3 minutes and win rounds that way. He might do, but I just think that from a skill set perspective, they're so closely evenly matched across the board, which, like I say, makes the betting line so surprising to me. But the other side to this is Chris Duncan's now had more fights at this level in the UFC. He's fought some good quality opponents. The only loss was the Torres loss in Mexico, in a fight that he was actually looking okay in as well. But Torres is a good fighter. So I just think that Duncan's seen more as well from an experience perspective. And as I always say on this podcast, for those that listen every week, in these types of fights where it's close and I'm getting like, a massive underdog on one side, which I think is completely unwarranted, for a close fight, for me having to, I'll never sit on the fence. I'll always make a pick and prediction. But when I'm that torn between both fighters that I really don't know which one is actually going to get the job done because it's such a close and competitive fight, more often than not, 9 times out of 10, I'm going to pick the underdog, which is what I'm going to do this time. I'm picking Chris Duncan to win this fight. And in the next fight, we're going to be following very similar vibes to the last one. We've got Nathaniel Wood versus Morgan Charriere. Now, as I say, very similar to a lot of what I've just said with Vucenic and Duncan. The first thing is I've been watching these guys fight throughout Cage Warriors as well, all the way through Cage Warriors into the UFC. They were just in Cage Warriors at different eras, so it's kind of interesting that they're being matched now in the UFC, because, like I say, they were just on a slightly different era by the time Wood was signed to the UFC. Charriere was just starting his rise in Cage Warriors, but Nathaniel Wood was a Cage Warriors champion, Morgan Charriere was a Cage Warriors champion, so that tells you everything you need to know about the quality of both of these fighters, which then brings me to the next point. The fact that we've got an underdog in this fight is crazy. Like with Duncan, if you were saying to me, okay, well, Chris Duncan was a plus 140, plus 155 underdog, I'd be a bit like, okay, I understand that, Duncan being the underdog, someone, unless it's a pick in which, not every fight is, someone has to be an underdog. And if it's Chris Duncan, okay, fair enough. But in this fight, with Wood and Charriere, man, I definitely think there shouldn't be a favourite or an underdog in this fight. I think it should be an absolute straight pick'em across the board. I think Charriere is getting favoured because of his split decision loss against Chepe Mariscal, who Chepe Mariscal's looking like a beast. So I actually bet Charriere in that fight, and I actually thought Charriere had won the fight, but it was close enough to go either way. It wasn't a robbery or anything like that. It was just a super close fight. Now, the fact that Chepe Mariscal is doing what Chepe Mariscal's doing and Charriere went super close with him is the only reason I can think that he's the favourite here over Nathaniel Wood, because the other two fights that Charriere's had within the UFC have been against fighters that are just absolutely nowhere near the quality of Nathaniel Wood. Now, Nathaniel Wood has had plenty of UFC fights at this point, is a UFC veteran with a ton of UFC experience, and he does tend to lose fights when he's stepping up in competition, but he's also got a lot of wins against good quality opponents as well. Now, quality of opponents that are in and around where Morgan Charriere is at right now. So this is why I think it should just be a straight pick'em, because from everything surrounding everything but the stylistic sort of explanations, which I'll get onto shortly, everything's super close. Then when you look at these guys stylistically, striking, very close, probable slight edge to Charriere. Wrestling and grappling, very close, probable advantages to Nathaniel Wood in those areas. But again, it's like I'm clutching at straws even saying that there's slight advantages in the areas that I've just mentioned, because they're just both so well matched. And one thing about Morgan Charriere is, regardless of who he's fighting, whether he's fighting a fighter that's better than him or a fighter that he's better than, he always fights super close. Like, Charriere is very rarely in these fights where he's absolutely dominating somebody that he should be beating. And then, look, because look, this would be what defines Charriere. If he was fighting someone that he should be beating, dominating them, right? But then he goes against fighters that are much better than him and going close. And I know he's had a couple of dominant performances in the UFC. I'm talking more back to like the Cage Warriors days. Charriere's got a history of fighting close against pretty much everybody he's matched against. And I just think that Wood is another one of these fighters that he's going to be fighting close against. And the same thing for Nathaniel Wood. Nathaniel Wood fights super close as well. And the reason both fighters fight super close is because they're both well-rounded. They can both take fights wherever they want to take them. And they'll both bite down. They'll both exchange with whoever they're fighting with, whoever's in front of them. And that normally typically ends up in super close fights. And I'm just seeing another typical super close fight between Wood and Charriere. If there's a knockout, it could be either guy. If there's a submission, probably either guy, again, if I'm being kind. And then if it goes to a decision, well, I think we're going to be left with either one of two scenarios. Either Wood's going to definitively win one round, Charriere definitively win one round, and then another round be super close, where that's going to cause a split decision. Or all three rounds we're just going to be saying, well, all three were 50-50 coin flips, take your pick. So, yeah, for me, it's another super close fight. It should be a straight pick'em in my opinion. I think it's the epitome of a coin flip type of fight. And as I've said a million times already over the last few podcasts, in these types of fights where I genuinely don't know, I'm going to be siding where I believe the value is, which is laying with the underdog, because I don't believe there should be an underdog in this fight. For those reasons, I'm picking Nathaniel Wood to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Jai Herbert versus Chris Padilla. Now, Chris Padilla is a fighter that, look, he's super young. He's explosive. You can see he's got a good, well-rounded skill set as well. I just feel for the next maybe 12 to 18 months, he's going to be a little bit hit and miss in some of these fights. Like, I think when he fights someone that's experienced, the likelihood he might drop that fight in regards to losing it, but then learn a lot from it and then go on a bit of a reset, beat a couple of 2 or 3 fighters that are there for him to build up, and then he gets another step up in competition, and maybe he doesn't do okay in that fight, maybe he drops that fight, but again takes a ton of experience and goes back to the well again. And I kind of feel like Padilla's gonna have a few fights like that for the next maybe like 12 to 18 months, but I do think that he's a fighter that is going to be very interesting to keep an eye on, because I do like his aggressiveness, his power and his skill set. Now with Jai Herbert, Jai Herbert is that experienced fighter that I'm talking about. He's a fighter that I think has still got something to give in the UFC. I think he's still got good qualities. The striking is technically good. He can wrestle and grapple. We don't see it too much, but he can wrestle and grapple, especially his grappling. I think his grappling's actually pretty decent. But the thing is with Herbert, he's kind of getting up there a little bit in age in regards to, the prime in the division, if you like. And he has been hurt and knocked out badly a few times. That does catch up with you the older that you get in this sport. So I do have the concerns about Jai Herbert in regards to, can he eat like multiple explosive shots from opponents? And it is a legitimate question mark in my opinion. And Chris Padilla will come forwards, will hit hard, he will land, he is kind of explosive. And this is a fist fight. So for as good as Jai Herbert is, he's going to have to be able to take shots, because in a fist fight, you're going to get punched in the face. That's just what happens. But still, I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt to Jai Herbert here, that he can weather any storm that Padilla's coming at him with, and he's going to be able to just navigate this fight using the experience that he's had at a higher level for a number of years now. The experience and fighting at a level that Chris Padilla doesn't have over Jai Herbert. So I'm kind of putting faith in Herbert being a veteran here and using experience, and if Padilla comes forward with some hard shots, him just being able to get out the way of him, or at least just close the distance a little bit further, tie up, pushes back to the cage, and just use veteran qualities to drag this fight and beat him. But I won't be shocked if Padilla does land something and knocks Herbert out, or if he comes in with a massively wrestling heavy game plan and he scores a number of takedowns to make this fight super close. But ultimately, I do think that this fight has got the ingredients and the recipe to be very close. It's just like I say, when I'm looking at the two fighters here, I am going to be I'm going to be choosing experience here over a fighter that is still in a developmental stage and will likely need another 12 to 18 months to be comfortably winning these types of fights. So for those reasons, I'm picking Jai Herbert to win this fight. And in the next fight, we're in the flyweight division. This fight is going to be sick. It's going to be fast. It's going to be electric. It's going to be powerful. We're going to just see like a fight that's fought at 100 miles an hour. We've got Lonnie Kavanagh versus Felipe dos Santos. Now, the UFC definitely seem to know how to match both of these fighters, but more specifically Felipe dos Santos. Felipe dos Santos came in to the UFC on a short notice debut against Manel Kape, out of all fighters, and put on an absolute barn burner with Kape. Didn't get the win, but man, got everybody's respect and got everybody's attention as well. Then he fights Victor Altamirano, which Victor Altamirano, you say what you want about him, he's in exciting fights, like he's a guy that I like watching fight. But Felipe dos Santos got put against Victor Altamirano in Mexico against Altamirano with Mexican heritage, and he did get the win. A lot of people thought he probably should have done. He shouldn't have done, and that it was close and maybe a bit controversial. I'm on that line as well. I think it was relatively controversial. But I suppose it's one of these fights that you just could have. Maybe it could have gone either way. Maybe I'm being a bit too harsh. But again, fun fight. At seriously high elevation. Then in his last fights Andrey Lima, who's looking like an absolute monster at the minute. So for Felipe dos Santos, he has not had an easy start to the UFC. Fighting Andrey Lima in his last fight. Before that, Victor Altamirano in Mexico. And then on his UFC debut fighting Manel Kape. Like, it's not been easy. And now he's got Lonnie Kavanagh, who's a fighter that I'm super high on. Like, Lonnie Kavanagh's got dangerous striking, good power, technical striking as well. And, he can fight on the back foot, which is something that I love to see. So he's not just like an pedal to the metal type of striker. He can also fight smart moving backwards. But then he's got wrestling, he's got grappling to go with that as well. But he's also a fighter that'll bite down on the mouthpiece and be super entertaining and electric and fast on the feet, and he's athletic. And I just feel that both of these fighters are going to clash in such a beautiful way. I think that Lonnie Kavanagh is going to have the opportunity here to be able to look really good, and that's key for him, because Felipe dos Santos is going to be game, he's going to be competitive, he's not going to back down, he'll be in the face of Kavanagh as well, And I just feel that Felipe dos Santos has absolutely got the skill set and the style to be able to bring the absolute best out of Kavanagh, which is bad news for Felipe dos Santos. For dos Santos to win this, I think he's got to get Kavanagh on the back foot a lot. I think he's got to land on him a lot. I think if anyone's going to mix in the wrestling and grappling, though, I think it's going to be Lonnie Kavanagh. I don't think it's going to be Felipe dos Santos. So this is another thing for Kavanagh. I kind of feel that in a 15-minute K1 fight inside the cage, I think he beats Felipe dos Santos. I don't think it's easy. I think there's going to be some scary moments. He's going to have to eat some big shots, but I do think he gets the job done. But then if this fight starts hitting the world of wrestling and grappling, then I think Lonnie Kavanagh has the advantages there as well. So now, in my opinion, there's two paths to victory for Lonnie Kavanagh to win this fight. And that, like I said, I just feel that the style of dos Santos is going to bring the absolute best out of Kavanagh as well. Sometimes you see this with some fighters where an opponent is just so well matched with you, so good that it just turns your levels up ridiculously and makes you perform at a level that you've maybe never performed at before, so high. And I think that's what's going to happen here. So look, electric fight, potential fight of the night candidate. Without even watching the fight, I know it's going to be ridiculously entertaining. But for a pick and prediction, I'm picking Lonnie Kavanagh to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got their heavyweights. We've got Marcin Tybura versus Mick Parkin. Now, Mick Parkin's a fighter that I do actually really like. I bet on him on his UFC debut. Plus money against Jamal Pogues when every man and his dog pretty much was on Jamal Pogues. But I knew Mick Parkin from the UK circuit. So although there wasn't too much tape on him and, he'd fought some fighters that didn't have the best records. But again, in the UK at the heavier weight class, I look at Tom Aspinall's record outside of the UFC. He was fighting guys with poor records as well. And that's just because in the UK, there's not that many big guys at heavyweight and light heavyweight, at both amateur and professional, for you to be matched with and tested how you would want to be tested at amateur and early pro level. So you can be ready for the UFC. I kind of felt like Tom Aspinall, from his experience of levels of competition that he'd faced, wasn't ready for the UFC, and same for Mick Parkin. But they both just got natural abilities. And like I say, I do like Mick Parkin. He's one of the lighter moving heavyweights. He's got good boxing. He's fast on the feet. But again, in the UFC, he's had this build up to the point where he's fought fighters that are in and around his level, some fighters lower than him, and it's just helped build his profile and confidence in the UFC. But now he's got a Marcin Tybura in front of him, who is absolutely the best quality of fighter that he's ever faced in the UFC. A fighter that's been in the UFC for so many years, that's fought the best of the best, that's hung around in the rankings of the UFC for years as well. And I think it's a massive test for Mick Parkin to see where he's at, because the thing is with Tybura can go on these losing streaks where you think he's down and out, but then he starts performing really well and showing the veteran qualities of his skill set and his fight IQ. And then he goes on these win streaks where you think, actually, okay, right, Tybura's on it now. But then he drops a couple of fights that you wouldn't expect him to drop. So there can be some inconsistency there with Tybura. But ultimately, he is this gatekeeper type of fighter. And I don't mean that disrespectfully, because, being a gatekeeper means that you're a top fighter. You either only allow the best fighters past you, or if you're not the best fighter, then you're going to get found out by Tybura, who's got serious qualities about him. So I kind of feel like he's got this gatekeeper status in the UFC, and this is one of these gatekeeper type of fighters. Let's see how good Mick Parkin is. If Mick Parkin's destined for, to be in, towards the top of the rankings, he's going to beat Tybura on Saturday night. But if he's not ready, then he's not going to beat him. So it's ultimately like pick your poison, and there's no surprise. Like Tybura opened, I think, at like -150, but the line's closing, and I think it's going to close into a pick'em for that reason, just because, it's going to be one of these fights where we wait and see. I think, though, Tybura's going to have enough for Mick Parkin, though, and I don't say that with a massive amount of confidence, because I do like Mick Parkin. I do think he is well-rounded. I do think he is gritty enough. But again, when you come into these fights where there's an up-and-coming fighter that hasn't truly been tested yet with the quality of opponent they're about to face, and that quality of opponent they're about to face has been in the UFC for so many years, fighting the best of the best and holding a ranking position for a long time as well. It just, when you have to make that pick and prediction, for me, I'm, again, more often than not, I'm going to side with the experience. It's not as if Tybura is getting dropped and rocked and knocked out every fight, and I don't think Mick Parkin's setting the cake alive with the fighters that he is. I know he had a good fight last fight, but like, you look at his Kamaru Usman fight, that was a fight that he could have easily lost. The Caio Mercado fight, that was a fight that, look, was back and forth at some moments. Yes, he did end up, pulling away and getting the win, but a bit too much back and forth for my liking. And look, even in those two fights, Caio Mercado and Muhammad Usman, I actually don't know if I said Kamaru Usman a few minutes ago. If I did, I definitely didn't mean Kamaru Usman. But with the Muhammad Usman fight and the Caio Mercado fights, like, if that's the type of performance that he has against a Marcin Tybura, I think Tybura wins that fight comfortably. So it's almost, is Mick Parkin actually making these jumps in levels between every fight? And we are going to find out on Saturday night. But until we see the fight, I don't think we can be massively confident in what type of outcome we're going to get. I do think it's going to be close and competitive. And I just like Tybura's experience and veteran qualities, and the fact that he can pose a massive threat to Parkin that Parkin hasn't seen before. So from a pre-fight perspective, that's the side that I'm leaning with. I'm picking Marcin Tybura to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got UFC newcomer Andrey Pulyaev versus Christian Leroy Duncan. Now, Christian Leroy Duncan's been an interesting addition to the UFC since he came in, because he's got tons of athleticism, he's got power, he's got crazy movement, he's got, an exciting, unique type of striking that the Cage Warriors level is. A Cage Warriors champion, by the way, which again tells you everything you need to know about a fighter. But at the Cage Warriors level, he was crushing guys, and he was always going to, he was UFC level fighting in Cage Warriors. So it was one of those where it was just a matter of time. But since he's come into the UFC, I don't think that he's flourished in the way that people expected him to straight away. But the guy's still young, he's still developing and improving, and I think we're going to get that in 12 months' time. But in the meantime, I still think he's in a developmental stage where he is going to be, tying everything together and learning that in the UFC it can't always be about flash, because you are going to get found out and you're going to lose fights because of it. You need to sit down, focus on fundamentals, and then flash comes within starting to control fights with the fundamentals that you can start to loosen up a little bit. So I think all the quality and I think all the ability is there with Christian Leroy Duncan. It's just going to take a little bit more time for it to all piece together, and then once the skill set and the quality and the ability starts tying together with the athleticism, that's when we're going to see a solid fighter. But until then, we're dealing with a Christian Leroy Duncan that is still very good, that is still very athletic. He's just, working to bridge everything together. And I think this is a perfect type of fight for him with someone like Pulyaev, who will come forwards, he will attack, but the thing is with Pulyaev, from what I've seen of him, he's very defensively open. He keeps his head on the centre line. He comes forward in straight lines. He goes backwards in straight lines. And the movement is very, I wouldn't say it's like static, but it's very predictable. There's nothing too crazy in there that's going to like confuse Duncan, that's going to, really make Duncan hesitant to attack because he's moving in a specific way and he's taking angles of his strikes and stuff like that. I think that Pulyaev is very meat and potatoes in regards to what he brings to his attack. But he also looks like the type of fighter that, again, when he's got the ability to come, when he's got the opportunities to come forward and be aggressive, he'll swing, he'll look to swing hard. But even then he can be countered. Like, he's open to be hit. But then when Pulyev's on the back foot, I just feel that Christian Leroy Duncan's going to pose a lot of problems here by his sheer size and athleticism. And then when you add in the speed and the sort of unorthodox movement that he has as well, I think Pulyaev is going to end up being quite confused. Like, there's no way that in this fight camp Pulyev's been able to have a training partner or multiple training partners that are going to be able to emulate exactly what Duncan does. So I think that Pulyev's going to going to be very sort of like a bit overwhelmed inside the cage with what Duncan's going to bring. And I do think it's a good fight for Duncan to get a big win in front of a home crowd. So, like I say, speed, movement, footwork, athleticism, and then the power to go on top of that. And then the fact that Pulyaev is somewhat defensively, I say somewhat, he is defensively vulnerable to be hit. I think Duncan's going to be able to find his mark here. So for those reasons, I'm picking Christian Leroy Duncan to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Shauna Bannon versus Puja Tomar. And this is an interesting fight. The first thing I looked at here is the betting line, because like Shauna Bannon is a fighter that I think is just going to go so close with so many fights. She's going to be one of these typical fighters that every time she fight, look, she's entertaining and she's down to scrap. Like I'm not saying anything negative there. Like I enjoy watching her fight, but I just think that she's for where she's good coming forwards and striking, defensively she can be got at, and it just makes for these super close fights where we're seeing split decisions, where depending on maybe what location that you're at, or maybe which three judges are in front of you, a different three judges might score it differently to the three judges on the night, and you know, depending on what judges you've got, could be any different type of score. Like you look at the fight that Bannon had with Alice Ardelean, like in my opinion that should have been a fight for Shauna Bannon to really come out and look great in. And you know, she was competitive and she did have her moments inside the cage, but ultimately it's these razor close split decisions that could go either way. And I just don't think there's too much longevity in the UFC, like when you go into split decision after split decision, because it only takes 3 decisions or 4 decisions to not quite go your way. And, you know, you're suddenly no longer in the UFC. So I can see Bannon's got skill set and ability with how she fights and her attack, but it's the defense. Like the attack allows counters, it allows opponents to come forwards. And this is where Puja Tomar is going to come in, because Puja Tomar, she's exactly the same. She's a fighter that's quite aggressive, will come forwards, will look to swing, will look to bang, will look to put volume together, look to mix things up. But defensively, she's so open to be hit. And that's where Bannon's going to get at her. So I think we're going to see a fight that's back and forth, super competitive. I think Bannon's going to land some good strikes. I think Tomar's going to land some good strikes. I think the volume is going to probably be within 5 or 10 strikes, whichever one ends up landing more than the other. But again, if you're only landing 5 or 10 strikes over 15 minutes more than your opponent, then it typically doesn't really mean too much. I just think we're going to see, look, if we see any wrestling, maybe that's from the side of Tomar, but I don't think that there's going to be, the fight's going to be won and lost on the wrestling and the grappling. I think it's going to be a fight that's predominantly played out on the feet, primarily played out in the striking world, and I think both fighters are going to land, both fighters are going to get hit. I think it's going to be, you know, just a back and forth fight. You strike, I put a combination together, you put a combination together, I take a round, you take a round, but those 2 rounds are both close, and then there's a third round that's a complete coin flip. I just feel like it's going to be that type of fight. And again, in these types of 50-50 fights that could be a potential coin flip, I'm going to side with the underdog, as I always do. So for those reasons, I'm picking Puja Tomar to win this fight. And in the next fight, this is another fight I think is going to be absolutely outstanding, and it's so good matchmaking. It's going to be a banger. We've got Caolan Loughran versus Nathan Fletcher, and I just think this is a fight that's just going to deliver. I think it's going to absolutely deliver. We've got Caolan Loughran, who is just a super aggressive striker, will come forwards, will look to land on you. He's as tough as they come, headstrong, physically strong. And he's one of these fighters that I just don't think you can't like watching him fight, just because he will come to scrap. He's not one of these fighters that's going to sit back and look for a way out or be defensive. Like, this is a guy that's going to come forwards that wants to take your head off, but it's also a fighter that can mix in wrestling and topside grappling. He can be quite heavy on top as well. And I kind of feel with the start that he's had in the UFC, I don't think people realise just how good Loughran is yet. Like, he's still very young. He came into the UFC, he's had a couple of really difficult fights to start with. I just think he's a fighter that people aren't seeing the true quality yet, but they will eventually. But again, the UFC have not matched him they've not matched him against an easy fighter. They've matched him against another super game, young, hungry fighter in Nathan Fletcher, who, will be in the face of your opponent, fights out of next gen in Liverpool. And this is the other thing, actually, going back to Loughran. He fights out of 4 corners in Liverpool under head coach John Gillis. And for those people that have never heard that gym of 4 corners, that is one of the toughest fucking gyms that I've seen in the entire country. Like, and bear in mind, I know the gym industry very well because I own my own gym with Mark Diakese in Doncaster, Mark Diakese HD Performance Centre. So I know the gym scene very, very well. And I'm telling you now, 4 Corners Gym, you talk to anybody that's ever trained there and they will tell you exactly the same thing. Now, going back to Nathan Fletcher, he's from Next Gen, the gym that's got, you know, your Paddy Pimblett, your Molly McCann. They've also got a solid, you know, roster of athletes that fight in that gym. So this fight is just so good. Now, when you're looking at it stylistically, I think that Caolan Loughran's going to be the better striker here. I think he's going to hit harder. And I also think he's going to be the one moving forwards, which makes the fight much closer from a pick and prediction perspective, because Nathan Fletcher, where I think Fletcher's got his advantages in this fight, is within the raw grappling. So when the fight hits the mat. So if Fletcher gets on top of Loughran, I think Fletcher's going to have a more successful time on top of Loughran in regards to, you know, grappling, looking for submissions than Loughran is on top of Fletcher. It's just, if Loughran's on top of Fletcher, I think Loughran's the better, you know, heavy blanket on top, land, you know, body, head, keeping the fight, keeping safe on top, but landing enough to take the rounds. Whereas Fletcher will be more fluid on the mat. He'll move around a little bit more. But again, the downside to that is he might give openings to someone like Caolan Loughran to get right back up to his feet, which Loughran is a good grappler himself. So this is what I mean, like, this fight is so well matched. I think, though, that the reason I said that where Loughran moving forward makes the fight tricky to predict is because I think if Loughran was a fighter on the back foot, I think Fletcher would be able to get more takedowns in regards to moving, because it's always going to be easier to hit a takedown whilst you're moving forwards than moving backwards. So I think if Fletcher was in a fight here where he would have a lot of forward pressure, I think he would comfortably win, because he would get the takedowns and then be able to, you know, to ride on top, and he'd be a danger on top. But the fact that I'm seeing Loughran as the fighter that's going to be the more aggressive fighter moving forwards, I think Fletcher's going to struggle getting the takedowns. I think Loughran's going to be the one getting the takedowns. But I think it's going to be one of these fights where Fletcher's that good from a grappling perspective. I think Loughran takes him down, maybe spends 20-30 seconds on top, but then Fletcher gets up. Then Loughran stays on top of him, stays on him on the cage, takes him down again. Fletcher gets right back up this time. And I just think we're going to see alternations like that, but with Loughran, with Loughran being the aggressor more often than he's not. And then out in the open space, like I say, I think Loughran's gonna be the one landing the harder shots. So, like I say, it's so tough, because in a different world I can also see Fletcher landing takedowns and doing well. It's just a super close fight that's been matched perfectly. But like I say, not only is Loughran the underdog, but I genuinely think that Loughran should be the slight favourite here. I can see a world where Fletcher wins. I can see a world where Loughran wins. But stylistically, when they're matched up together, I just have to side with the guy that I know is tougher, that I know there's absolute zero quit, hits hard, you know, tough as nails mentally and physically. And the gym that he trains at is one of the toughest fucking gyms in the entire country. Yeah, that's the side I'm leaning. I'm picking Caolan Loughran to win this fight. And in the next fight, the last fight of this podcast, we've got Guram Kutateladze versus Caolan Fernandez. Now, I do think from the betting perspective, the line has probably gone a little bit too far, but I'm just not that sold on Caolan Fernandez right now, and it just seems like maybe the betting market is potentially the same way. With that being said, though, Guram Kutateladze is more or less always a favourite in his fights, unless he's fighting somebody that is a legitimate step up in competition. And Caolan Fernandez is just not that. Like, Guram Kutateladze has fought better level of competition, he's beaten better level of fighters than Caolan Fernandez. Like, look at the Jordan Vucenic fight that Kutateladze fought last time. I think Vucenic would wipe the floor with Caolan Fernandez. So I think that it's a step down in competition, but Caolan Fernandez does have some good aggressive qualities that makes him an interesting fighter and an entertaining fighter, and a fighter that opponents have to mind the P's and Q's with. Like, I don't think Guram Kutateladze can come in here reckless and just think that he's going to run through this guy and not pay any attention defensively. Like, he definitely needs to be defensive here, and if he does, and if he is defensive, then I think he's got his comfortable fight. But like I say, he's got to get the defensive fundamentals there to be able to make this fight comfortable for him. Otherwise, it's going to be tricky and it's not going to be straightforward. But I think Guram is just better everywhere. I think he's a better striker. I think he's a better wrestler. I think he's a better grappler. And especially in some of those areas, I don't think it's just like a slight edge. I just think he's a legitimate better fighter. And I think that if this is a 15-minute K1 fight, Kutateladze wins the fight, but it just gives Caolan Fernandez, some opportunities. Maybe he catches Kutateladze, hurts him and finishes him, but I still would favour Kutateladze in a K1 fight against Caolan Fernandez. But then when you add in the wrestling and grappling, I think Kutateladze is just way better trained, way better coached, and has the better skill set there, to the point where I don't think he's going to go all in on the K1. I don't think he's going to go all in on the wrestling and grappling. I think he's going to mix it up, and that's what's going to make it super hard for Caolan Fernandez. Because as Kutateladze is striking, kickboxing, throwing his strikes, I think Caolan Fernandez is going to be liking this and thinking, right, I've got opportunities. And then he takes a few shots. He might take a minute or 90 seconds to losing the fight. But then think, right, it's okay though, because I'm growing into the fight. I've got my reads. I'm going to get there. And then just as Kutateladze is finished beating up on Caolan Fernandez a little bit on the feet, striking, bang, level change into a takedown. Now Caolan Fernandez is thinking, well, I didn't get my shot on the feet, and now I've just been taken down, and I can get held down as well. Need to get back up to my feet. But then Kutateladze's got a decent topside grappling game. So then maybe the round ends like that, and then they start again, and Kutateladze starts striking. Caolan Fernandez thinking, right, now's my time. I've got to go. Start striking. Bang, level change again. I just feel that Kutateladze's got this fight, and with the right game plan of shooting into to break, I wouldn't even say to break flow and momentum of Fernandez, but I would just say shooting into to stop Fernandez from actually making headway in this fight. Like, just as Fernandez is thinking, right, now it's my time to go, if that's when you're hitting the takedown. So he's not actually gone yet. And this is why I think it's going to be a relatively, as long as he minds his P's and Q's with the striking, I think it's going to be a relatively comfortable fight. So for those reasons, I'm picking Guram Kutateladze to win this fight. And that's all for this episode of the podcast. As always, to everybody tuning in, thank you for listening. If you're on one of the podcast platforms like Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Music, or Apple Podcasts, or any of the other podcast platforms, please feel free to come over to YouTube. It always helps us when you subscribe to the YouTube channel. It helps grow that YouTube channel, helps the algorithms as well, which we are seeing more and more people commenting and, saying who you're betting on, telling me where they think that I'm wrong and where we disagree, and, delivering other points. Maybe I've missed something that's super important that you want to mention that you think's a massive factor. We're starting to see on YouTube a lot more interaction in the comment section. It is me that gets to the comments as well throughout the week, and it is me that replies personally. So if you do want to come over to our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/MMA Play 365, subscribe to the channel because it helps us. Drop your comment in there. I'll reply to you. Unless you're a dick, then I'll definitely not reply to you. But yeah, come on there. Majority of the time, everybody's sound anyway. So I do like conversing and going backwards and forwards with you guys. And yeah, everything helps the algorithms, and it helps MMA Play 365 as well. And for one last time, if you're wanting to jump into the action this weekend, then make sure you do so at MMAplay365.com. Something for every type of gambler. Everything's super affordable. Our ethos here at MMA Play 365 is we want you to make your money back as quick as you possibly can from the price that you've paid for our subscription packages, so then you can start profiting on top of your bets. And that's the reason why we make the packages super affordable. We're not out here trying to charge you $500-600 a year, because then that's going to be more time for you making that money back without profiting on your bets, and that's what we don't want. So make sure you want to jump into the action. It's MMAplay365.com. I'm Newsome. Thanks for listening. I'll see you again next week.